A lot of women are researching ancestral traditions. I would say, especially in the last 20 years, more and more a move, even within European culture, women looking for ancestral recovery work of how do we get something back which is authentically ours, and not necessarily having to draw from these other wells, but having our own authentic place to stand. It's getting to the local and the indigenous that gives us much more insight of what all this looked like before hierarchy, before domination became systematically encoded into human societies. The local gives us a lot of insight because when we're stuck only to the literate tradition or even to the statues, which, these granite statues that are made, basalt sculptures in Egypt and other places, it takes a lot of wealth to create those images. They're created from an elite level that in a culture that still reveres goddess. And I think that's an important insight because so much of the research we've done, there's like basically two streams that come out. One really is greatly based in literate tradition, where you have documentation in written form from Egypt, from Sumeria, from Europe, from India, of goddesses and stories about goddesses. But another aspect is the very local village level, whether it's indigenous people or even just in Europe and other imperial societies, where you have the local goddess of the well, the spring, the cave, the mountaintop, the grove. And those goddesses, they're very much embodied in nature. And unless you're in that one place and talk to those villagers, and a lot of this has gotten swept away, but even in recent centuries in Europe, the people in the fairy faith are talking about the fairy of this cave, the fairy of that place, and they were still interacting with her, right? And sometimes she's a shapeshifter. She becomes a serpent and she flies through the air. She plunges into the pool in Franche-Comté out in eastern France. There's all these local stories. And so that is a way for us to trace through orature and say, this belongs to us. And look, it's like all these other peoples, all these other places. We have these parallels. We once had sweat houses in Europe. The Irish had the tachan alish, which just means sweat house. The Finnish sauna. You had sweat houses in the Czech Republic. There are medieval pictures of people going into sweat houses. You have the Russian bozhina, which means basically it's from the same word as God and goddess. It's the divine place. And just like with the Finns, everyone sets aside all hostilities when they go into this place. And we had the drum. We had all these things. So there's a special attention that we have to give from a European perspective to what happened. How did this all get done down and done away? And that takes us to the witch hunts, takes us even earlier to the repression of goddess, the banning of goddess, the prohibition, the destruction of goddess temples, and the whole way that the Christian church hierarchy did its utmost not only to get rid of goddess but to ban priestesses. There could not be female power in any form. It had to be systematically subordinated. So in the medieval era, the early Middle Ages, the priesthood is chasing after these healers and diviners, and they're trying to roust them out, and they're trying to get people to stop going to them. And they're trying to stamp out the spiritual practices and the ceremonies and the chants. So in order to do this, they begin writing penitential books, which are also called confessional manuals. And they're actually interrogating people. Is there any woman who, and then it's like, gives herbs or whatever the ceremony might be. They're trying to actually isolate and identify who are the leaders in these ceremonies, who are the wise women that people are consulting, and trying to force them to stop. But in the process of attempting to stamp out this pagan culture, they inadvertently preserve a record of it for us to read. And it's very biased, it's all cast in terms of devilish ceremonies, but they're telling us things about women making knots or healers that are, things that are done with herbs or sacred stones or sacred trees. There's a beautiful passage that is first written down in around the 800s in a Latin source from France. And it says, basically it's targeting those who, and condemning people who go to springs and trees and stones and the ceremonies that they're doing there. And they're saying, well, this is foolish and you should stop doing this. This is paganism. But we have an Anglo-Saxon translator that rendered this into Old English. And he adds a tagline. And so he's referring to people who are following the teachings of the witches. And so, if they go to stones or well springs or trees, swa wiccan tacheth, as the witches teach. And this tells us several things. It tells us that witches are spiritual authorities, that people are listening to them, and that they are practicing earth-based spirituality. That the sacred is numinous and pervasive in earth and water and sky and plants and animals. And that's the culture of animacy. So, swa wiccan tacheth, the witches are still being seen as teachers. They're not yet being cast as harm doers. So this is a very honest little shred that shows us that even the clergy, and there are other examples of this in the Anglo-Saxon literature, that even the clergy recognize that the witches actually did have powers, that they were actually curing people, that they were seen, and sometimes very much so, as the competition to the priest, who wanted to make his sign of the cross over the sick person. And they even admit in some of the passages, forget the name of the bishop that's writing this, and he says, God gave you this disease, and so you're going to have to bear it with courage and not complain and not go to these devilish women who are doing these curing practices because God doesn't want you to. He didn't say because God didn't want you to be healed, but that was the basic gist. It's like it's better to suffer than to go to the wise women. And there were men as well, but anyone who was practicing these heathen ways, it's better to suffer and die than to go to these healers. So they actually say that out loud.